Welcome back, friends, to the 2021 Nelson W. Trout Lectures at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. This has been such a rich event, and each session, it seems to me, has just built on what was laid before. This is our final, what I've called main stage session with the URL, main conference URL. Just a reminder that there are 2 upcoming sessions that have separate URLs for which you register separately. At 3:30, a Bible study on discernment and vocation. You can register at tinyurl.com/Bible study ELCA. And at 8 p.m., another opportunity for a discernment conversation. You can register for open for African descent persons only. You can register for that at tinyurl.com/discernment panel. And also you'll see links to get you to those registration forms in the chat. This afternoon's session is an exciting one, a conversation about womanist theology. I cannot do that topic justice. I'll just say, if you haven't yet had a chance to see the presentations from our doctoral students last night, doctoral candidate Denise Rector did a wonderful, succinct job of not only locating herself, but her studies and a brief kind of definition of womanist, pointing us toward more expansive thinking. I'll simply say one way of talking about womanism is to say that it is an approach that centers the experience and the voices of Black women. And so we have a panel here today of Black women scholars who will be talking about womanist theology from their own experience and with respect to the disciplines they're studying. I expect this conversation will be every bit as lively as the conversation among the graduate students last night. You are welcome to post questions in the Q&A link or in the chat link. We'll get to the questions we can. I think we have a treat in store for us just listening to these wonderful women speak amongst themselves. We have 4 panelists joining us. They may choose to tell us more about themselves, but I'll just name their institutional locations. And I'll go as I see them on my screen. Ms. Denise Rector is a PhD candidate at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Dr. Beverly Wallace is Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Linda Thomas is Professor of Theology and Anthropology at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And Dr. Valerie Bridgeman is Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Homiletics and Hebrew Bible at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, just up the road from us here at Trinity. Having told you who these wonderful women are, I am going to sit back and listen and learn as they reflect on the significance of womanist theology.
Well, that was interesting. Where to start? I'm going to start because I may be last on the list and start by saying, hi, Sister Linda. So since I hadn't had a chance to speak to you. Womanism is sisterhood for sure. And I would start there to say womanism is sisterhood. I have known myself to be a womanist since 1989 into 1990. So however long that is, and I'm a biblical scholar, and I would name as one of my mother's mother mentors, Renita Weems, who decided to mentor me as a biblical scholar, even though we weren't at the same place. I was trained as a biblical scholar by all white men who were allies to the work. That is to say, they really wanted me to do the work that I wanted to do. And that isn't always people's stories. And in 1990, that certainly wasn't always people's story. So when people learned that I graduated from Baylor, they always worried that I somehow didn't have the kind of support I needed, when in fact, I had amazing support from these Southern white men who saw the value in locating ourselves within our own traditions, within our own stories, and within our own healings. So that's what I want to say about myself. And say again, hi, everybody. So I don't know where the conversation is going to go, but I wanted to introduce myself.
I'm going to make room for our elders in ministry, not by age, since Dr. Valerie went first. Dr. Linda, if you're here, I'd love to hear from you, and then I'll go after that, and then perhaps Denise can follow us.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace, and it's great to see everyone. I am Dr. Linda Thomas. I'm a professor at the Lutheran School of Theology, and I am delighted to be joined by my doctoral student, Denise Rector. This is what one of the womanist tenets is to grow more womanist, and so I'm glad that Denise could be with us. I attended Union Theological Seminary, and that'll be part of the conversation, but I was there doing a remarkable time of having Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, and Jacqueline Grant. I was an MDiv student at the time, and they were PhD students. I then left Union and pastored churches, and knew I wanted to get a doctorate, and with the suggestion of Dr. Beverly Harrison, who was at Union at the time as well, went to the American University to get a degree in social and cultural anthropology. So I do constructive womanist theology and anthropology, as in studying people. And now with bringing those two together, really look at how Black women in their constructive relationship with God. So I'll stop there.
And I'm so glad to be in the company of my three sisters here. I was going to bring a picture that I had of the 25th, I think it's the 25th anniversary of Womanist Theologians, where both you, Dr. Bridgeman, and you, Dr. Thomas, right there in the front. I have that picture on my phone to this day. Again, I'm Dr. Beverly Wallace, Associate Professor of Congregation and Community Care. That's what they call it at Luther. But for the longest, I've been teaching pastoral care. My beginning was with Jocelyn Bennett, and that was even before I became a pastor or even a scholar, or a religious, teaching scholar of the church. Jocelyn Bennett was working with our national organization, the ELCA, and the project called the Black Family Ministry Project. And so I was trained in how to work with congregations around developing ministry opportunities for our congregations. And then I went to seminary. I went to the ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center, where my womanist mother, and she may not know that she's my mother in that vein, but she still scares me to this day, but I love her to life. Dr. Jacqueline Grant was my professor of systematic theology, but also at the ITC, Dr. Carolyn McCrary. And oftentimes when you hear about pastoral care, you don't hear about the pastoral theologian, pastoral care theologian, womanist theologians that are in our midst. but there's quite a few of us. We even have a Facebook page of pastoral theologians, womanist theologians that are doing work around the healing work that's necessary and thinking theologically about healing the wholeness of the community. And so that's some of the work that I do. One of the tenets, and this is what I should have started with at the beginning, one of the tenets of womanist theology is that indeed we're inclusive. And so as I think about my sisters here, I also want to think about my brother, whose name we have not called yet, Dr. Richard Stewart, who is right now in hospice care, suffering with a brain tumor. And so I want to lift up his name here as, as we think about what does it mean to be a womanist. And so indeed, part of the tenets of being a womanist is that of being inclusive. And so we can go from there. Denise.
Hello, everyone. I am so thrilled to be in this number with Dr. Bridgeman and Dr. Wallace and Dr. Thomas. I count you all as such fantastic scholars, and I'm happy to be the student here among you all. My name is Denise Rector. I'm a third year PhD student at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. I earned my Master of Divinity from Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And an independent study course there is when I first began reading White Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus by Dr. Grant, and got exposed to some other works in the first wave of womanism. And I just saw myself, and it was one of few places that I saw myself in the Lutheran Church. Black womanist ethics hooked me because of its discussion of historiography and ethics. And they were feeding into the questions that I've had for over a decade about Lutheranism in America. So when I had the opportunity to do a PhD, knowing that I'd always wanted to teach and had always wanted to research and write, LSTC was a great fit. And to have the honor of working with Dr. Thomas was just sealed the deal. So my background as far as my research goes is in both history and in ethics, looking at what the ethical use of history is, what it means to be imago Dei and see myself in history or not see myself, and then what it means for me to leave a record and to lift up what womanists have done for the next generation. So those are the areas where my work is focusing now. And for my introduction, I will leave it there and we can talk more as our conversation continues.
Well, I think I'll take on the role of the host here. I remember a couple of years ago, I invited Dr. Bridgeman and Dr. Marsha Foster Boyd to Shaw University Divinity School, where we had a lively conversation, specifically around intersectionality in my classroom. Knowing that the work that we do, whether or not we're doing biblical scholarship work or anthropology or ethics or pastoral care, it's all connected. And so I was just wondering if Dr. Bridgeman and Dr. Thomas, if you would begin the conversation about how do you understand womanist theology and the importance of womanist theology for the work that we do as a church and a community.
Well, I can begin, but in my comments, I just want to talk a little bit about where the term came from, to set it up historically. Alice Walker termed the course the term, and it was in an essay called "Coming Apart" in 19 1979. And then she wrote an edited volume of her poems or an essays called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. I think that was in 1983, where she writes a 4-part definition of the term. But it does talk about self-care, talks about subjectivity, that is, that we begin with ourselves and telling our own stories, our own narratives. And I like to think of womanism as, number one, being confessional. Not all Black women are womanist. It is a term that one chooses to call themselves, versus all Black women, together can be categorized by that term. It's one that one chooses for oneself. And I look at it as meaning when I walk in the room, I bring my full self being who I am as a woman who is Black, also as a Black person who is a woman. But it doesn't stop there, because womanists are also anti-oppressionistic. And what that means is I'm concerned about the people in Nirma. I have a student who is at LSTC, and when the women in that context are shot at and killed by the military, I'm concerned about that. And she's studying with me to become what her equivalent of being a womanist is in that context. I'm also concerned about what's going on in India. So womanists are always concerned about who is the most vulnerable in a global context. Now that's how I define it from my standpoint as a anthropologist and a theologian. So the global is very important. It is also communal. You heard Dr. Wallace talk about men, and particularly Black men. So it is men and women and those who call themselves women and men and children. It's about siblings. And it is also spiritual, meaning I believe that there's something bigger than me that makes the world work and brings us together. It's also environmentally concerned about the earth that the Creator has made. And Alice Walker also talks about women loving women. It is concerned about LGBTQIA+. And so we are concerned about transgender women. So it's a full-fledged component of the humanity that God has made and the fullness thereof and the flourishing of life. So that's what I'll do to talk about definition of womanism.
Okay.
And others can bring their perspective now.
Okay. I'm not quite clear what you asked me, so I'm gonna try to restate the question and then try to answer it. I think you asked me, how does womanist theology function for me? Is that what, was that the?
For you and for the community, how do you introduced yourself as a biblical womanist scholar, but I also know you as a homiletician.
Yes.
And so how do I, and I'm thankful for, again, starting with the definition, because definition is important. So how might you use your womanist tools to engage?
So I'm gonna be very womanist and tell a story. So how about that? One of the first papers I wrote at Baylor those of us who were in the PhD program was invited to write around a topic. And I was trying to work with a phrase in Alice Walker's definition in Search of Her Mother's Garden called loves the whole folk. So I did this piece on Leviticus. I wish I could find this paper because I would now like to think about this more fully on that title, using that title. What does it mean to love the whole folk, right? That's the phrase that she used. So I always think when I'm thinking, Dale Andrews actually helped me with this, which is when you're thinking about preaching, how does the most vulnerable person in the room hear what you're saying? Where's the good news for the most vulnerable person in the room? Not the people who feel like they got it all together, but the people who may not know where they're going to sleep tonight, or the partner who has been abused by their partner and they're trying to decide whether they're going to go back home. What is what you got to say about this text, whatever text you're using, gonna say that's gonna strengthen them, encourage them, and give them some insight about a God of liberation, right? So that's the homiletic of it, but that's also the hermeneutic of it. So when I'm thinking as a biblical scholar, I'm thinking to myself, how do they hear this on the street? How might I be informed by what BLM is doing, Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives is doing? So when I wrote the piece on A Long Way from Home on Psalm 137, I saw the scripture about those who sat down by the rivers of Babylon. There they required of us a song. I saw it for the first time as a protest, and not just as these people were sad, because I can see among protesters their refusal to perform for their oppressors. So for me, womanism allows me to see from these different apertures and these different lenses, bringing my whole Black woman self to it. And I just want to affirm what Dr. Thomas said, because I know a Black woman who is offended if you call her a womanist.
Yeah.
And so I want to be real clear. I am self-identified and clear about my womanist stance.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I remember first year I was in seminary, maybe it was my second year, we had to take a preaching course. And so the topic or the theme that I looked at was the role of Shipwreck and Pua in liberation. So oftentimes we lift up Moses as the liberator. And so my thought was, what about Shipwreck and Pua?
Right.
And that's what I think womanist scholars do. We look and do the analysis, looking at it from the perspective of, from a Black woman's perspective, you know, from a gender's perspective, from a race perspective, and even from a class perspective. You know, what was her role? What were their roles in this? And so, even as I teach pastoral care, I also bring into that the hermeneutics of the using scripture to help inform how we're going to think about caring for God's people, all of them, and seeing their perspective from the perspective of gender, from race, and from class. Denise, would you like to add to that?
Actually, I would. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. And I'm so thankful to have this conversation to sort of spark some things that actually might relate to one of the a Q&A question that we have about the relationship historically and theologically between womanism and feminism. So what Dr. Wallace was just saying about these sort of power analyses, whether they're class related, whether they are related to race or ethnicity, whether they're related to gender, those are things that that as a womanist in my scholarship that I'm extremely intentional about. And the story of Shipwreck and Pure is so interesting because the thing that you said, Dr. Wallace, about how everybody sort of thinks it's Moses, that becomes sort of this historical idea that needs to get re-examined, that doesn't necessarily get re-examined unless you're intentional about doing it from a social location. So being able to look at historiography, how we talk about what's happened in the past, being able to set up an ethical frame that applies to somebody of a different social location or a different class. Those are the sort of questions that I'm interested in as a womanist. At the beginning of Black Womanist Ethics, Katie Geneva Cannon talks about the history of Black women in the US as a way to get at what the academy thinks is ethical versus what real life experience is. And there's a centrality of experience, a privileging of experience that happens in womanist theology. My experience, my imago Dei, my God-given Black womanness is essential for theology. And I see stories differently. This is why we see Shipra and Pua, the story differently, because there is a power analysis along the lines of class and along the lines of who's ruling and who's ruled, that can get overlooked and that might otherwise be overlooked if it weren't for womanist biblical studies. So to get back to feminism versus womanism, historically, there's been an adjacency to whiteness that some white feminists have that gives them a lens that is not my lens as a womanist. When people started reacting in favor of liberationist theologies, whether it was feminist, whether it was Black theology, it was the beginning of taking into consideration the vast diversity of God-given humanity and making all of those experiences and those social locations important and centered in theology instead of centering just one way of being or one way of living or one way of understanding ethics or even one way of understanding history. So that, I think I'll leave my comments there and then um, let someone else jump in.
Thanks, Denise. I'd like to say that Shifra and Pua are kind of central to my life. One of the things that women may not discuss very often is loss, particularly loss of children. And early in my life, I lost 2 children. And as I was coming to understand what that meant, I worked with a very special therapist who encouraged me to name my children. And I named them Shifra and Pua. I believed that they were girls, and they midwifed me to take off in life in ways that I might not have without having their experience. This is my first public talking about this, and I can't think of a more appropriate place. Dr. Bridgeman, which you're bringing up, Shipwreck and Pua, I just smiled immediately because those babies continue to be with me. They are ancient, and they certainly continue to midwife me. As I think about the differences and similarities between womanist and feminist, I can easily see myself as a Black feminist. That's what Alice Walker is, or that's what she is. And she simply got tired of adding the word Black in front of feminist to distinguish herself from white feminist. But for my use of the term, what term I use, it's contextual. So when I'm in my Black church experience at Trinity United Church of Christ, I am a Black feminist. And I want to see myself as a Black feminist to be clear with my church family how I stand among the community. And that, yeah, I want to see God as she as well as he or as they. I want to also hold Black men accountable to what it means to be a Black woman living predominantly in a white world where racism is a primary concern. And when I'm in the African-American community, particularly in domestic places, find myself being very concerned about gender and the kinds of things that Black women live with in their homes, and wanting to have equity and equality, and not be living a lie at home with Black men, be they brother or husband or what have you, that I need to have consistency. And I think that I don't like to have binaries, so I use the terms interchangeably depending on where I am. And in a white context, predominantly white context, I am definitely a womanist. I want the community to hear me roll out that womanist, that Black womanist, and so that before me in white context, predominantly white context, that they see me as a Black woman. And but it's not a binary for me, and I think for some people it's an either or. For me, it's both and I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, go ahead, Valerie.
No, I was just going to say, Dr. Thomas said what I wanted to say, which is that somebody asked about it historically. Historically, Alice Walker used the term after she was sitting in a room at a cafe with a group of white feminists who heard somebody say something racially charged, and said back to her when she called it out, that has nothing to do with us. And so it makes me think about Janetta Cole's God is a poor Black girl, I think it's the name of the essay. Again, the most vulnerable among us. And it was then that Alice Walker said, if you can't see how these two things are connected, them calling me the N-word or singing a racially charged song and your feminism, are we actually doing the same kind of work? That was what made her even start thinking about the term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely Shipwreck and Pua are some of my favorite persons to call on. But the other one that I call on a lot is Hagar, the story of Hagar and Dolores Williams in her work about Sisters in the Wilderness, and then Emily Town's work around issues of health, because that's another tenet, caring for oneself and their health. And so how might, and the theme of this conference is that about healing. How might a womanist, from your particular field of study, look at healing or health from a womanist perspective, from a preaching or for a biblical understanding, looking at Hagar perhaps from an anthropological perspective, from an ethical perspective. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah, I can speak to this in terms of I guess it would be called healing from my heterosexism or my homophobia as an out cisgender womanist. I want to remember Renee Hill, who wrote a very important article called "Who Are We to Each Other?" reminding heterosexual and probably cisgender heterosexual Black women who call themselves womanists, that Alice Walker's definition talked about women loving women. And I think that my healing, once she wrote that article and I began to say, well, what is my role? I have to claim my privilege as a Black woman who is heterosexual, and all the ways that I can display that in public, in private. And when I began to think about what it would be like for lesbian women who are women of color, that's a very dangerous space. And we know that to make it even more complex, Black transgender women are the folks who are most often killed. I talk about my healing of this because I think that just as I think that racism is toxic, sexism is toxic, I think that heterosexism is toxic, and that was a toxicity that I think I carried around with me. But guess what? I don't think that it's been fully released any more than I think that racism and sexism are fully released. I think it's all about my self-awareness. I think it is such a privilege that I've had to work with students who are LGBTQIA, and I then become a student. But most of all, in the best way that I can, I am called through the public ministry, and I think of the public ministry of Jesus and what that was like. I find myself at this time in my vocation as a professor mentoring students who are LGBTQIA, and that journey from one place and remembering my privilege really calls me to advocate, to help build safer communities, but most of all, to help folks have their voice and to build a body of scholarship around queer theology and what name it. But I want to go back to Renee Hill's article calling us out, and I think for the first time, again speaking publicly as a privileged cisgender out heterosexual Black woman, and what my healing has been around that topic.
Um, you ask about from the discipline. Thank you, Linda. That was, yes, I just want to say amen to that. I will say, as someone who teaches both preaching and Bible, but also who is an administrator. So I'm wearing 3 hats at any given time. So I'm always thinking about the shape of the ethos of the school. You know, how are we shaping the world in which our students are learning, in which we claim to be learning together? What is it that we are asking of one another? I mean, you would think that inclusive language is the bottom, like it's an easy line, right? You know, an expansive language about God, and you know, still people rankle at that, but that's a place, and it's a place to start, right? If you ask me about teaching preaching, it's where what I said before, which is I am oftentimes will give students a scenario, something that has happened in the community, and here's the text, and you must now preach and take into consideration this that has happened in the world. And a lot of times I know, and I'm gonna say this is gonna be my racial statement. A lot of my white students particularly don't want to speak to a situation. They just want to quote, preach the gospel. And then, you know, there's a certain level of students of color who quote, think preaching the gospel mean not mentioning anything that happened in the world either. But that's not typically, it's typically coming from my white, oftentimes more conservative students. So I'm making a statement. I'm not berating them. I'm just describing what happens. And then I push them, like, your job as the preacher is to speak on behalf of God into the world where people live, not the one you wish they lived in, but the one they actually live in, and then to look over the shoulder of the divine and show people a world that could be, and help them find the courage to go make that world happen with the help of God, of course. So that's the homiletian in me. The biblical person in me is again fueled by Katie Cannon, who is an ethicist who was, people may not know, did biblical studies before she became an ethicist. And she often asks the question, it is truly written, but is it truly right? So asking people if they know how to walk away from a biblical text, and this, or to say that ain't right, or to say it's in the Bible, but it ain't godly. So giving students the kind of courage that allows them to do that kind of work.
Yeah, and Katie Cannon, I don't know if some of you may know this, but she went to a Lutheran school in North Carolina. She started out at a Lutheran parochial school in Concord, North Carolina. And it was there where she learned to do some of the questioning that's made her who she is, or who she was, and continues to be as one of our ancestors. And you know, the work continues in that regard. Denise, did you want to add something to that? Because I do have a question
I can add just a little bit
Okay.
about what healing looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So I belong to a denomination that is 90% white.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always had the question about teaching and about leadership, which is what's led me to history and its ethical uses. So both within church leadership and within the academy, one of the things for me that points towards healing is the acceptance and the understanding of contextuality, because we contextualize everything, but we only admit that we contextualize some things. What we call theology is contextualized in a certain way, in a certain Western white European way, but we don't talk about it as contextual. And if we can bring in other contexts, all that is that for some reason I've come across people who think that that's a danger, and really it's just a reflection of God. So to bring in these contextual pieces into the academy, and to then know that we're training pastors in different contexts, not just a singular context that ends up perpetuating the issue that we're trying to solve, is one of the things that is my goal in academia, to begin to bring about some healing.
About maybe it's been maybe 15 years ago, or a little bit less than that. I did some work around womanist ethics in the Lutheran Church with Black women, wanting to know about their understanding of womanist ethic. And what was interesting was that they did not necessarily use the language, but they were doing womanist ethics. And so I guess one of the final questions before we get to Q&A from the audience is how, I'll start with me. Another article or chapter that I wrote, I used the experience of my mother, saying that she was the first womanist that I met. And she taught me how to be a womanist, you know. And so oftentimes when we start, when we talk about womanist theology or womanist pedagogy, all of that, we start at a particular time. I believe that we've been doing womanist work, or people have been doing, Black women have been doing womanist work for a very long time. I'm wondering if you could bring in your own personal, because that's what womanists do. We bring ourselves, our whole selves, to the conversation. When did you realize that there were womanists before you that shaped you into being who you are? Or were there?
I think for me, you're talking about proto-womanist, and that would certainly be when I talk about it. When I realized I was a woman, I was Black most of my life.
All of your life?
I mean, I know, obviously I knew that I was a girl, a young woman, but what it meant to be a woman as it stood before God and my call was when I was a student at Union Theological Seminary, and the Black men there questioned, why was I there? And it led me to do a search for a usable past. And in that search, the woman for me would be Sojourner Truth. I had not known who Sojourner Truth was until I began to do that search for a usable past. And then I found her being a advocate for women's rights, as well as for race, and that combination was so important to me, and how she went around preaching. One of the stories I like about Sojourner Truth is she was going to Indiana, and the white people said, well, when you come, we're going to burn down the building that you're going to be preaching in. And so she said, then I will preach upon the ashes. That one that I really like. The other real life situation that led me to, I think, become a womanist. So I'm moving from one who was a proto-womanist that influenced me. And then the action of making a decision of being a womanist, and this might have been even before I knew the term, but when I was at Union, Jim Cone was my advisor, and by the way, the anniversary of his death was just this week. So, but I was writing a paper and had become very interested in feminist, and in a conversation with him in his office, he said, Linda, you will have to decide what you're going to do, what you're going to focus on, whether it's going to be Black theology or feminist theology. And I had what I call common sense, which was not to debate that with him at the moment, but there was a clear answer that I had, even though I did not say it. And what I said in my mind and in my heart and my gut is I do not have to choose. I was not born a woman first and Black second. I was not born Black first and woman second. So even then I was saying, this is not a binary. I do not have to choose. I was made in God's image, a woman who is Black, a Black person who is a woman. And again, I did not say it out loud. I didn't believe that Dr. Cone was one for me to debate with on this at this point in my life. I was an MDiv student, but now that I am a full professor, I declare that this is what I said. And most of all, I think I'm claiming that we do not have to choose. And this is what intersectionality is about. It is both, and it is all three things, and it is all five things, and I am made in God's image. I refuse to separate. And the world will, but all of that is to answer your question, Dr. Wallace, about how all those things came together. They continue to come together. And my teaching exposes that. Just speaking a little bit from the previous topic, my teaching, I teach a Black Lives Matter in theological anthropology. So all the things that in my discipline are happening in the world is what I teach from a womanist perspective. And that means that while I'm being particular, I am also able to open that up to a global or a universal perspective. And that would take more time to explain, but particularity always leads to universal. It's when people try to be universal and make that particular that it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you. Dr. Bridgeman?
I would agree with you that my mother was the first person that she would never have used the term womanist. But one of my favorite stories is one time when I was like 12 years old, and my dad was in the kitchen yelling some Bible scripture. And my dad was a holiness preacher, some Bible scripture, and my mother obeyed, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughter you are. And my mother said, you're not Abraham, and I am not Sarah, and these are not Abraham's time. And then she turned around and looked at her daughters and said, come in, dinner's ready. And that was the end of the conversation. Well, it did two things for me. It let me know that he wasn't the authority on what the Bible said, and two, that you could question the Bible. So that became my hunt for the God of my own understanding. That moment when I was 12, and it led me to womanism.
And Denise, I think you have the last word because I think we only have a few more minutes.
Just a couple. Yeah,
Okay.
I can make it brief. So Dr. Bridgeman, what you brought to mind for me was me sitting on my living room floor when I was 8, listening to my mother and my godmother talk about scripture. And we had a pastor, obviously a male. I grew up Baptist. There was a very sort of patriarchal hierarchy to the church that I grew up in. But to sit and listen to my mother and my godmother wrestle with scripture. What does this mean? Well, the pastor said this, and well, it says right here X, Y, Z. And then to be with my mother and her church friends just out in the world and seeing their experience and learning from their experiences how to be the Black woman that God made me in the world. Those are the two things that come immediately to mind with your question, Dr. Wallace.
Thank you. And I raised that question because not everyone here in this audience are going to be, pastors, or deacons. There will be, there are people who are doing ministry in their communities as what they're called lay people, and they too can be womanists. And so I just wanted to show we have a long history of that. Dr. Kleinhans, thank you all.
Your comment there at the end, Dr. Wallace, reminded me of a comment that soon to be Dr. Vandiver made toward the end of his presentation last night. He said, not everybody's going to preach a sermon, but everybody can live a sermon. Not everyone is going to be a womanist theologian or pastor, but you can live this way in whatever you're calling in life. And I think that's part of the healing work, right? To affirm the community, the roles of people in the community. And as far as affirmation goes, thank you, right? This has been a wonderful Trout event. There are still the two events left, the Bible study in a different Zoom room at 3:30, a discernment conversation, open to people of African descent at 8 o'clock. But in terms of the major programming, this is the last piece of it for this year. And you have blessed us, you four, with such a wealth of wisdom and grace and personal experience and sharing. And we are excited for you to continue your scholarly work and your pastoral and personal work among us. So thank you so much. And for everyone attending this year's Trout event, again, thank you. We will make videos available next week so that if you want to review something or share it with a friend who couldn't be here, that is a possibility as well. Now, may God bless you with the strength and courage and wisdom to live as God has called you to live.